Welcome to our briefing with Dan Stewart, who's the international editor of Time. Hi, Dan. You're in London. You've actually worked at Time for a good few years now. I've noticed that it's just changing such a lot at the moment. Can you run us through some of the ways in which it's changed?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today. I hope I can be of some help and some use. I joined Time on New Year's Eve 2013, and I was in New York at that point. It has been quite an evolution. I moved here in London, where you can probably tell I'm from, in 2016. We've had, I think, 5 separate owners in the time that I've been at Time, which is pretty incredible. Time Warner spun us off to Time Inc., which then sold us to a magazine publishing company in Iowa, who then 2 or 3 years ago sold us to Mark and Lynn Benioff. Mark Benioff, who is probably best known as the chief executive of Salesforce. Also, some of you may know him for his philanthropy. He is a very eager and keen philanthropist, and I think he bought Time, and hoping he's not going to sell us off to an Iowa publisher.
So does it make a difference who the owner is?
I think so, yes. I mean, to have an owner that's actually invested in your success and wants you to do well. I think Mark, from what I'm told in the meetings that they had when they were debating who might be sold, who might be interested in buying Time, he was very keen in knowing what our kind of 50-year plan was versus what our 2-year plan was. There is the advantage, of course, that Mark and Lynn are billionaires, and their investment in Time, they don't necessarily need to see it bear fruit in the way that, say, a private equity company might. And what he has encouraged us to do, which we haven't really had at Time, I think, before he came, is to really take risks, to invest in innovation, to think about ways we can go from being what I think we're best known as, which is a weekly news magazine, to being a media company, really, to think about all the ways in which we can experiment with new ways of telling stories, with new ways of reaching audiences, and bringing readers in, which is what we've sort of been engaged in since he bought us back in, I think it was 2018. Yes, 2018.
So one element is the magazine. Mm-hmm. So tell us about that. I mean, who is reading the magazine, in which countries, and in what sort of numbers? Just the physical magazine to start with.
Big question. So we have, some of you who may be familiar with Time from a long time ago will know we used to have 3 separate editions. We used to have Time Domestic, US, Time Europe, and Time Asia. We no longer have those distinctions. We have one global issue that we put out. We publish on a fortnightly schedule now. It's not something that we've made a big deal about, but again, it was part of our recognition, really. And I think, Mark, you and I were talking about this just now, that the market need for a weekly news magazine is not great. People don't necessarily need to know what happened in the week before they were reading a publication, and if they do, there are places where they can get that. And I think for a general news publication, it was us thinking, well, actually, what if we did a longer, more quality product on a slightly different cadence? We could get a lot more kind of quality stories in. So I think we're on newsstand sales in 45 countries. I think we have subscribers. I keep asking how many different countries we have subscribers in, but nobody seems to be able to tell me. It's dozens around the world. We have a very strong readership, I mean, in a lot of different markets, but our primary readership is in the US, of course. But we have very loyal readership in India, in Hong Kong, where we have an office, in the Philippines, in parts of Africa. Our stories always perform terribly well when they're on Nigeria, for example. So there are a lot of places around the world that have cultivated this loyalty to Time, and that we still have.
When you're writing a story, you don't have in your mind your reader as, let's say, American from the Midwest or something. Your reader could be in Hong Kong.
Well, yeah, I think absolutely. Although what we try and remember is that we are still an American publication.
Yeah.
Our stories sort of have to make sense. One of our sales guys talks about it. You know, we cover the world in an American accent, I think is the way we do it. I think probably in past times when we did have a product that was specifically for a European audience or for an Asian audience, or rather an East Asian audience, we might have, cultivated coverage specifically for them. But I think now that we have this more global remit, we sort of think, well, primarily American, but we're not doing sort of specialist content that will only be of interest to like.
But
we're trying to be quite broad.
Can we just unpick that? Cover the world in an American accent. Obviously, you're not American. I mean, right. From our point of view of thinking of the stories that might work for you, how does that translate into covering stories, in Africa, for example?
Well, I mean, I don't think it needs. I mean, I think there has been a perception, and sometimes with American media, that you need to have an American character at the center of it, or it needs to be about American people creating change around the world. I don't agree with that. I think more it's of things that have a sort of global resonance, if you like, issues that we're bringing to the table that I think that will speak to the concerns of people around the world. I mean, you raised Africa. A story we did in our climate change issue just a few weeks ago was reported out of Kenya, and it was in the Rift Valley, the lakes in the Rift Valley that are slowly, because of the large amounts of flooding there, that are slowly merging and may displace communities that exist around those lakes, and that is fueling migration into cities. And so we use that as an example to talk about the challenges which cities are facing from this shift from rural to urban migration. And that gave us it was a story that was reported in Africa. It was about Africa, but it was about an issue that the whole of the world is going to be facing.
So, when we were talking beforehand, you were saying you're more choosy about stories. So you're looking for stories that have wider implications, that maybe epitomize something bigger that's going on.
That's exactly right. I mean, we're trying to scale up our ambitions as best as we can. There was a point at which the economics of the internet made it sensible to become a kind of breaking news organization, if you like, and we did that at time for a bit. We're moving away from that, I would say, now. If we do sort of one-day stories, we want to try and have something about them that is different. If there's something like a major news event happening around the world, we'll try and cover it, but in a way that adds something to that coverage. But we're trying to focus on bigger swings, if you like, rather than.
So you think your audience is maybe using you to supplement where they're getting, so they might be going somewhere else just for the news headlines, and they're coming to you for more depth or detail or a different perspective.
That's exactly right. Okay. That's exactly right. And I think we all feel, especially on the international team, we feel that our mission is to sort of help explain the world to people, but in a way that gets past the headlines, and helps people, understand what is happening.
Okay, so I asked you about the magazine. Let's then talk about your online presence, because again, you were saying earlier that roughly 10% of your journalism goes into the magazine, and therefore 90% goes online.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, that's not an official number, but I would say, I mean, we are producing journalism for online all the time, and that's across a variety of different platforms, right? I mean, obviously, our video coverage isn't going into the print edition, for example, and that's a large part of what we do. We have a big video team doing short form documentaries, but also longer form. We have Time Studios is a component which was set up again after Mark and Lynn bought us. And we are increasingly partnering with documentary makers to help give a platform to people who might not otherwise have one. and partnering mostly at this point with American television studios. Produce content for them. So that's one element of it, for example.
And Time Studios are also launching a podcast?
Not unless you're telling me something I'm not aware of.
Well, you mentioned, I think, an email that had gone out or something. Yeah, and there was talk of you. I mean, obviously, you're going to get into podcasts.
Yeah, I think
because it's such a huge. Well, it's an exciting area. There's a real audience demand, even if your podcast were just a reading of one of your features or something. People would definitely be listening.
There's definitely appetite within the organization for podcasting, and I have definitely had multiple conversations about this. I think it's when we do it, we want to do it at a level that it will get noticed, and we don't want to do it by half measures, I think. And as you say, there is a lot of appetite for podcasts. It's also an extremely crowded market, and we want to do something, I think, that does something distinctive. But yeah, I'm not sure what the status. We looked at doing a climate change podcast, and I think we're still thinking about whether or not we would do that. Climate change is a pretty core pillar of our coverage. Right now we're focusing on, we just relaunched our newsletter, so we're trying to build up an audience that way. And I think, a lot of these kinds of projects will be, as we're building up a more engaged audience, we'll start to create products to
so how big is your global audience, and is it again predominantly in the US?
Well, we have changing. As we said in the announcement that we made yesterday, we have 2 million subscribers to our content, and that's across print and digital. I think something like 1 in 5 of our readers is from outside the US, which, of 2 million people is quite a large number. But again, certain stories that we do will have bigger audiences outside the US. And we'll cater more to them, I think. And you have a goal of reaching 10 million subscribers by 2030. That's right. Yeah. And we just launched a registration paywall. It's not an official paywall, but if you read more than 3 stories on time.com, you get asked to register, and then at a certain point you'll get asked to subscribe. I think in common with what most publications are now doing, to try and urge our loyal readers, people who come back to us, to invest in our journalism. And it seems to be working very well. We, I think like everybody else, we look at stories that have a high rate of people signing up as a result of them. We try and do more of those stories. We try and think about the things that those stories are giving to readers, that is making them decide to subscribe to our content, and think, well, maybe those are the things. Can you give us 1 or 2 examples of stories? It's just always interesting for us to know where the audiences are at. You have an insight into where the audience interest is. Yeah, for our particular brand, we noticed it a lot with our coverage of the coronavirus crisis in India. We have this very loyal readership in India, and I think we were giving them coverage from the ground there, but we were also publishing voices of quite prominent journalists and people who are making big statements. And I think for whatever reason, it found an audience there. We also found, a lot of the times with these sorts of things, you'll get quite a small but passionately dedicated readership who will then subscribe to things. We noticed that in our Myanmar coverage, which I wouldn't have predicted, honestly. It's one of those conflicts that I think, we found has been quite hard to grab the world's attention. But the coverage that we did do from there, we were working with a local reporter and a reporter from outside of the country to give some safety, as probably most of you will know. Reporting in Myanmar is quite a high-risk activity at the moment, and we wanted to give some safety to reporters who are working with us. But we were doing dispatches, profiles of protesters, and that reached a small but very, very dedicated readership, and we saw a lot of people come back and subscribe as a result.
So those are both examples of sort of running news stories, India and Myanmar. What about more off-agenda features, or are you more where people come for something in the news, but for analysis?
Yeah, I would say the climate change, the big climate change stories that we've done have also attracted audiences, and I think what we've tried to do as best as we can, is take big swings, if I can use an American phrase. Try and think ambitiously about the climate change coverage.
Can you explain what big swings mean?
I think it's sort of a baseball term, and when someone pitches a ball at you, that you sort of hit for the rafters, if you like.
Okay, yeah.
Try and be ambitious.
Think big, yeah.
Yeah, and we did. This is a little while ago now, but we did, for the first of our climate change issues, we did a big dispatch from the Amazon rainforest, and this, I think, was very shortly after Bolsonaro's election, so it was definitely front of mind, but it was one of those things that we felt hadn't been done as much. We sent a reporter onto the ground with a virtual reality team, and they sort of created this landscape of deforestation. The idea was that you could actually see this thing happening in front of you, and we had Jane Goodall do a voiceover for it. So we just tried to make it into a sort of multimedia experience, as opposed to and beyond a sort of 20-page story that appeared in Time magazine. It was. Yeah,
can we just talk about your climate change coverage, and this is climate is everything? Is that?
That's right, yeah.
That was the title of the special issue.
Yeah, so we have, Climate is Everything was the cover of, it was our special issue. It's also the name of the newsletter that we've just relaunched.
All right.
We've broadened our climate change reporting team. We have, and I'm happy to send these names to you if it's of interest.
Yeah, that would be helpful, yes.
A lot of readers, a lot of the people on this call will be very interested in it. We have 4 correspondents. Justin Warland, who is sort of probably our main correspondent on this. He's been covering it for a while. He would really cover climate change at the policy level. He is reporting from Washington, DC. We have Aaron Baker, who some of you may or may not have worked with before. She's our former Africa correspondent, bureau chief. She's now based in Rome. She deals with the sort of human impacts of climate change. She went to Antarctica for us. She was the one who reported the story from Kenya. She's one of our most experienced foreign correspondents and is going to be doing a lot more in that vein. And then we have Kira Nugent, who's based in London, and Alejandra de la Garza, who's based in New York. And they are covering sort of innovation in climate change, sort of from an American and European perspective. But each of those correspondents will write the newsletter once a week. And the idea of Climate is Everything is to look at the very many ways around the world in which climate is impacting the way we live. Migration is just one, probably the most obvious example, but the way we eat, the education. A story that Kira reported was a little bit about how this growing awareness of climate change is changing education programs in colleges and universities around the world, and in ways that you might not expect. You don't think if you're doing biosciences or what have you, you might think climate change will probably impact you there. But in a range of different fields. Architecture was the one that she focused on, that now to be a qualified architect, you need to have a greater understanding of how global climate change patterns are happening. And so yeah, that's the idea of it, is to think about, well, what are the unexpected, surprising ways in which climate change is affecting the way you live your life.
So you're trying to take climate change out of that environmental box. This is a sort of environmental story. You're showing that it impacts in every aspect of our life.
Yeah, that's the goal of it. And I think certainly the the idea of having kind of unexpected ways in which this is changing,
Yeah.
I think is a really useful prism to do it. And we want our journalism to be unexpected. We want to surprise people with the things that we're telling people.
How are you measuring the success of that project?
Well, I mean, we've just relaunched the newsletter, and so I think we have. I'm not going to give you a subscriber number. I don't know it off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But I know that we're reaching new audiences with that. Justin has a very strong following within kind of climate change policy. So it does, it has quite a, I would say, quite a high level readership, if you like. But
so one of the aims is to influence or to reach policymakers.
Yeah, that's always been a goal. I mean, Time has a very strong readership in Washington. We still have, I think, a deal where issues of Time, this is only our print edition, are delivered to each member of Congress.
Yeah,
every
charge.
And so every Congress representative in the House of Congress and every US senator will get a copy of Time. Not the case for British lawmakers, but yeah.
So the coverage is aimed both at policymakers and the mainstream public.
More, I would say, at the mainstream public. Yeah, I mean, we're not The Economist. We have a much broader, more general readership. And we don't really consider ourselves on the same sort of lines as them.
So, I mean, obviously, a lot of people here are involved in climate change related issues. And I'm sure we'll have some questions. By the way, if anyone has questions, just put them in chat, and or just put your name in chat, and I'll come to you as we go along. Do you have any insights into ways of telling the climate change story? I mean, I guess you have already given us some insight, which is the element of surprise.
Yeah, and I think
how do we sort of wake people up?
Yeah, I think to puncture people's perceptions about this being something they don't need to worry about. I mean, I think, that work isn't so much on us. I mean, I think you look at the, especially the young activist movement that seems to have been able to speak to especially young readers. And we've hijacked that along with everyone else. We made Greta Thunberg our Person of the Year, and we have a strong relationship still with her. I think we followed her right from the very beginning, and but we've found that giving platform not just to Greta but to other young people who are speaking, and to ask them, what are the things that you want to read about. We did so 2030, which is a project that I'm happy to talk about as well, which is reporting.
Yeah, I mean, just for people who don't know, this is your 2030 project. So there are two big projects: Climate is Everything and 2030. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, so 2030 is something we started. We have a partnership with the World Economic Forum, who meet at Davos every year, and they've launched this big thing called the Great Reset, where they think about, ways in which the world is going to change post-pandemic. And my editor-in-chief said, what I would really love to do is to do something that looks at the sorts of problems that we have to fix globally, and the UN SDGs give a good idea of the kinds of projects. And of course, they have a sort of inbuilt year of 2030 that they're going to report on progress into those. How about we look at, we start a sort of project of reporting on these things on an ongoing basis, on a macro scale that allows us to take a step back and look at things, to commit to pursuing certain things over the course of 10 years. And so that was what really birthed the idea of the 2030 project. And really we're looking for that at sort of solutions for the future, I think, is the things that we're trying to think about. And it's a microsite on Time. It's 2030.time.com. And I mean, in general, I think what we try and do at Time, and generally how I approach my job as an international editor, is to avoid telling stories that simply point to problems. I think this speaks to what you were just talking about of engaging people. I think, people don't want to have problems shoved in their face. And if I can name drop, and then you probably hear the clang if you're near North London, but I interviewed David Attenborough a few years ago for Time. And it was at a point where he was having a little bit of blowback for his sort of late conversion to climate change, and people were sort of taking him to task from the fact that his programs had shown this lovely visions of nature without showing how much a threat it was. As you will know, 4 or 5 years later, he's made a complete transformation. But he was saying that he just, you can't scare people into caring about things, and actually, you can show them people problems by pointing at the people who are trying to solve them, even if those problems don't have solutions. I want to emphasize it's not about viewing the world through rose-tinted spectacles. There are hopeless situations, but when we're reporting on hopeless situations, we want to show the people who are trying to fix them, trying to make positive change, even when in the face of horror and awful things. So that's sort of the approach that we're taking to 2030 as well. And it's sustainability, but it's also equality. It's improving economies. So it's a little bit more holistic than just climate change. Anyway, the reason I came into that, it was because Vanessa Nakate, who is a Ugandan activist, joined a sort of committee of people who are helping us report about, helping advise us on the things that we want to report on for 2030. And so, very useful to have people that were able to say, hey, we want to report on something to do with this, are there things that are of great concern to you, things that we should be looking into? And we're pleased because Time has this wonderful reach and this brand that people know that they want to be involved with it and help us tell the stories that we do. And so we have I think 20 people now that we've asked to be on the 2030 committee, and helping us to contribute story ideas or taking part in talks and things like that. And that's something we launched in January, and we're going to run it until 2030.
Okay, I have a few more questions, but let's make this as interactive as possible and bring in some of the audience. So Bex from British Red Cross, do you want to say hello?
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Thank
You've been
you.
listening intently.
Yeah, really interesting, particularly on the problems and solutions side of things. I'm always really interested in that, and I'm a ridiculously positive person, which quite often is difficult because I'm a former journalist and now I'm obviously in the media team, and it's difficult always to place the solution stories, I think. So I'm really interested to hear more about kind of what your audience wants in that space. And there are, within the British Red Cross internationally and in the UK, we've got lots of kind of interesting sort of standalone case studies of particular things that are being tried or that have been successful. So for example, kind of lots of innovative finance solutions in terms of climate change and helping communities kind of be ready for a climate emergency. So sort of giving people money in advance, for example, of a hurricane coming or something like that. So I'm just wondering whether a story like that would be of interest as a standalone story, or if that's the kind of thing that you would sort of collect and use in combination with other things, and how best to sort of pitch things like that to you.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, when we start to see a trend happening, and if we can report on a kind of case study as part of that reporting, I think those are the kinds of things that are useful for us to know. I think, for us, the stories that we're less likely to take are a press release that's just sent out to, the media list, which might make it into, page 15 of the Times on a news in brief, but aren't really the kinds of things that we do. I think.
But Dan, do you think it's interesting that the British Red Cross, as part of its humanitarian work, is putting in place measures to prepare communities for the impact of climate change? I mean, that's not what you would expect.
Yeah, and actually a welcome thing, right? It's usually reactive, and being proactive in this is a really important thing. And yeah, I mean, and is that in like globally? Is that Bex, or is that where in that particular countries or particular regions?
It's in particular countries, but I think the other thing is that a lot of the stuff that we've been doing internationally is now there's crossover now to the work that we do in the UK as well. So again, if that's an interesting story.
Yeah, our UK audience, I would say, is pretty small. Just, I mean, sort of I guess, by the by, as you all know, we have a very robust domestic media here, and I think most people would get their media from a newspaper rather than necessarily. I mean, I think they might come to Time if they want a slightly more global aspect to their media diet.
So you're less interested in UK only stories.
Yeah,
unless they refer to Harry and Meghan or Diana.
Well, that's an American story now, Mark.
Yeah.
Unless it has global ramifications. I mean, I get pitched stories quite often from freelancers here on healthcare policy in the UK and the importance of, and something like that. It's hard to see that have relevance unless you are a consumer of UK healthcare.
So, Bex, does that answer your question? Do you want to say anything else?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Chris from the One campaign.
Hello, sorry, it's very pertinent considering what's just been said. I'm Chris, the media manager from One. Actually, we have quite a...
Are you familiar with One, Dan?
Is that the I'm thinking Bono. Is that the same?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, your former editor was our first proper CEO, Michael Elliott.
Right, the late.
So, which is background to how One became, because Michael commissioned Bono to do the interview, which also had the front page of Can Bono Save the World, and he's still yet to do it. So,
it was our person of the year, right?
2002.
Yeah,
20 years ago. But that's, so we've got an interesting connection there with Time. But I suppose it is kind of just feeding off the last one around how, because I guess we will always be viewed as foreign news to Time magazine, with audience predominantly, I mean, global, but like, so what do we need to do to pitch to you? Because I think we know that the government do listen, or they're very, very alert to what is being said about them internationally, perhaps more so than what is being said about them domestically. So the idea of a piece, Boris Johnson's British government is bonkers in Time, to be alliterative, would probably send shockwaves more than some of the national papers here. So like what is it that we need to do to kind of approach you? Because you just said around international ramifications, and sure you might have been aware that the UK is cutting the aid budget, and what that means specifically when they're about to host the G7 in like 2.5 weeks, where the line we've been pushing is like throwing a party but then asking people to bring their own furniture to sit on. It's weird. And had some weird kind of rumors around the international fallout, but what is it that we need to do to approach you that will make that story fly and it won't just be clogging up your inbox?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough question. We don't do a lot of work on kind of British government policy and how that has ramifications around the world, just because, I mean, we are primarily an American publication. I know the UK is a key ally still of the US. Maybe not as key ally as they might like to think, but like the story about the UK cutting aid, I think, is a hard one, because the conversation over US aid is its own sort of separate story. I think I've definitely had pitches before when people have said, well, look at how the ramifications of this aid is played out in this particular area. And it's just a hard thing, I think, to really get our audience engaged with that when it's not their taxpayer money. It's not necessarily something that I think unless the outrage is so great that it becomes an international story, but those stories come along, I think, pretty rarely. but I think, if there are, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. If there are instances where it will be, a partnership between, an alliance of different countries doing something, or if there is an area where the UK government or where aid is making a particular impact in a place where traditionally it has been in the US backyard. I know there's been a lot of interest, for example, in things that the French government has been doing in North Africa, right? In places where, the sort of anti-Islamist stuff they've been doing there. We've considered doing reporting on that before, for example. And so, if there is an area where the US has had, like near the US border, for example, where there might be a particular interest, on Cuba or something like that.
I'm wondering, would you be looking at things like vaccine dose sharing? Because I know there's quite a lot of interplay there between different countries sharing doses, not sharing doses. I think Biden has committed to, well, they are almost at the point now where they are doing like a really big thing around that and the kind of comparison there, because is that the sort of thing you're kind of suggesting in terms of, because it relates back to the American audience of taxpayer, it is taxpayer dollars there, but it's also contrasted against the UK, the EU.
Yeah, and I think, that's actually an example of a global story, right? Like the vaccine availability is something that I think there would be interest in that purely because people want to know that these vaccines that are happening, that are making such change in America, that there is sort of becoming vaccine equity, and I think we want to try and keep people aware of that. So yeah, I think that's a story that there will definitely be interest in. But it's harder when that becomes like the British government is doing this, other people aren't, I've had conversations with the Foreign Office as well, where they've said, oh, we really want to promote the work that we're doing in promoting media transparency, right? Or I think there was a big focus maybe 2 or 3 years ago to say, we're going to protect journalists and all this kind of thing, and saying, well, okay, which is, we find very interesting, but then the sort of British role in that versus the American role in that, it just becomes quite hard to pass for us.
Okay, thanks, Chris. We have a question from Helen from Weber Shandwick. Hi, Helen.
Hi there. Yeah, Weber Shandwick. I work with clients across the board, sort of health, development, all sorts, on their comms. Really, it was just, if we have a story that concerns health, and I'm thinking of one that I was trying to pitch last week around the global crisis in nursing, and I sort of pitched it to someone I dealt with in New York before, but it occurs to me that probably wasn't the right way to go about it, because it is very global, kind of anchored in WHO decisions this week, and also some really good case studies in Pakistan and Africa and other places. So is it better to pitch kind of to you as international, or more sort of vertical approach on something that's health related?
I think probably in the first instance, I would advise going to the health editor. If you're enterprising, I'm sure if you don't get an answer back from them, to have someone else to go to is a good idea. Usually on health stories, I will, myself go to the health editor and say, hey, we think this is an interesting story to do from an international perspective, but we rely on your expertise to know these things. I think when I get a release that interests me, it's usually offering me something that other people don't have. And I think this speaks maybe to the thing I was saying about press releases, is like, if you come to me and say, hey, we've got a story that we're doing, and here's an embargoed version, even if it's an embargoed version of a study, that to me is more appealing, that I'd be able to get like a kind of some element of exclusivity or something that, is not going to be elsewhere. I think I'm usually a good point. I get a lot of pitches, mostly from freelance journalists, I would say, but a lot of pitches coming through the door from around the world. And often with those sorts of things, I'll think, well, okay, if this is primarily a story about health policy, then it's probably more a story for Elijah, who's our editor in New York, or Alice Park, who may have been the
Yeah.
person in contact with. She's been a health writer in New York for a long time.
Yeah.
But I think if it's primarily a story that says something about a particular country or highlights something that is happening in that particular place that is worth drawing attention to, or, you know, then that's probably more of a story for me. But again, when it crosses both things, we try and keep up what we call air traffic control. So, you know, if I'm doing a big health story, I'll usually want to have some input from the experts who will know this stuff better than I do, and perhaps can help guide our reporters. We do a lot of teaming up on stories as well, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Dan, can you just help tell us about the setup? Why are you in London, and who else is in London? What's the difference between what gets commissioned from London and from New York?
I probably should have done this to begin with. So Time has about 120 journalists around the globe. The majority of those are on the East Coast of the US, in our New York office and in our Washington office. We have 2 other offices in London and in Hong Kong, and we have a handful of contributors or stringers or correspondents in dotted about in cities: Paris, Shanghai, Rome, a variety of other places. I oversee international coverage from London. It's a useful time zone to be on because I can speak to both New York and Asia. And so a lot of the commissioning international stories, we don't have an international editor in New York anymore. However, we are quite an integrated organization. It's not that it's not that we have stories that have a Time London imprint on versus stories that don't. Our photo team is based in New York. Our video team is based in New York. We collaborate. I collaborate every single day with my colleagues in New York. It's not one of those things where we're sort of an autonomous bureau and do our own thing, which I think it might be in some other organizations. The New York Times, I think, will probably have a similar sort of thing to that. We're not like that. We consider ourselves much more of a satellite office than a bureau. And actually, I think bureau chief is a title that we're sort of working to remove from Times vocabulary because it's not terribly useful for the organization that we are now.
Okay, that's great, thanks. Kim Nelson. Hi, Kim.
Hi there. So yeah, it's Kim from the International Rescue Committee. I just had a question. I think Chris might have mentioned G7 already, but obviously that's, I'd imagine, will be a big focus for a lot of people on this call and organisations in general. So I just wondered, Dan, if you'd be able to give us sort of any steer on what your planned coverage is around the G7. You know, will you be there in person, kind of reporting on it? And are there any angles around the G7 which is of particular interest to you?
So what we've found, to be honest with you, with these big sort of world leader shindigs, if you like, is that the coverage that resonates, the only coverage that might resonate with our audience is sort of the high level foreign policy sort of opinion pieces, really. We have a foreign policy columnist, Ian Bremmer, who would probably weigh in on what happens in it, what it might achieve. But I think we wouldn't use it, honestly, as an opportunity for a great amount of coverage unless there was like a specific thing that they were coming together to look at and resolve. But I think, I don't know, it feels to me like the value of those things, I don't know that we've necessarily seen a G7 that has produced, I mean, certainly not for during the Trump era, right? They're like, you didn't have, I mean, I think for the last 2 G7s, you didn't even have they couldn't even agree on a communique post G7. And so in terms of it actually having practical implications, we haven't really seen that. And yeah, I will say it does not drive engagement from our readership. But I'm interested to know why it's of particular interest to you. Do you feel like policy changes come from that? Is it really that important in terms of like how it guides your work?
Well, I mean, we are definitely focused a lot around it in the UK because of the UK holding the presidency this year, and also kind of in light of the aid cuts and like cut the aid budget, which we're sort of trying to push that point that it sort of slightly undermines sort of these big events. And it also, I think, seems to be a big, you know, the kind of rhetoric from the government about global Britain, and seems to be a big priority on their radar. So I think that's one side of it. I think the other side, we're still sort of trying to think of ways that we can kind of talk about it. But kind of one idea that I'm sort of having is there are sort of real implications of the issues that they're focusing on, which organisations like the IRC and who have these kind of practical examples of, say, you know, rising hunger or the COVID pandemic affecting low-income countries, we can sort of provide kind of tangible examples to the kind of slightly lofty things they're discussing it in that meeting. So that's kind of a way I was trying to think of sort of bridging that, the thing you were discussing about it being quite a sort of high level thing, but also having kind of real world examples of like why it's an important meeting, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing, but again, I'm not sure that. Yeah, I think probably your average person wouldn't see the things that they discuss at the G7 really impacting their lives. I mean, it's what again, Ian Bremmer calls the G0 effect, right? He wrote this book sort of talking about how there's this vacuum of leadership at a high level, and that actually the sort of the Western alliance that might have created progress in the past just isn't as effective at it now, and really questioning the value of a G7 and what you can actually get from it. I will say we're gearing up a lot more for COP26, which is also being hosted in the UK this year, and I think is going to be a focal point for our coverage. And I think it has the advantage where progress is sort of inbuilt into it. Like, they have to come out with something at the end of it, and if they don't, it's a failure, and if they do, it's a massive success. And I think that will drive a lot more attention, I think, from our global readership. So we're planning bigger coverage around that.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, can you tell us a bit more about that, Dan? What are the aspects of COP that you're particularly focusing on? Are you talking about global leadership, America, China?
I think it's probably the motivating idea, and we're sort of still right at the beginning of thinking what our coverage is going to be. We have a climate change issue that's likely to come out around about that time, and I think probably the motivating thing is not having the global South being left behind in the climate change conversation.
Yeah,
we did a story on that maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, sort of when the discussions were happening, beginning to happen, of like, oh, well, will COP26 be happening in person or not, and will it be this kind of hybrid in-person thing? And at the stage we're likely to be at in November, the Western countries are mostly going to be vaccinated and the developing world is not. And if there is this sort of unequal thing where, again, it's a bunch of G20 countries that are able to be there in person and are not, then isn't that sort of counter to the objectives of this thing? So I think we'll probably be getting into that a little bit, but also what we really want to do is to explain to our readers why what happens at COP26 really matters to them, and the targets that are going to be discussed, and what the obstacles are to getting to those targets, and the work that we still need to do, and also the people who are doing that work and find ways to do it. So I think we're just beginning that conversation, but yeah, I have a feeling that'll be a real focal point for coverage for us.
But you're up for any ideas or suggestions of things that may be talked about at COP26 that people here are interested in?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, you do mention the perspective of the global South, so I guess you might get a few emails. So
to that.
after we finish, or at some point, you can give me a few email addresses and then I'll distribute them to everyone here. So we have a couple more questions. Jonathan from WaterAid. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, sorry, I'll try and ask this question. I've got some very noisy builders. I'll try and get it in before they make their next drilling. You mentioned formats and how you're trying to innovate on format terms. What does that mean in practice, and what would you welcome from any organisation such as ours in terms of formats that you're exploring?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jonathan. It looks like in the comments, I think Anna had a similar question, which is about pictures and video. And so I guess I can wrap those together. I'll be honest with you, it's quite a high bar to clear for multimedia. I think actually it might have been you, Jonathan, who sent us a photo story.
Yes,
Time has a historic reputation for photography, and I speak on behalf of our photo team here because I don't commission photo stories. I don't commission photographers. I'll commission a story and then our art team will find a photographer for it. It's not like sometimes I think commissioning editors in the UK might themselves commission a photographer or might buy in photography that they think works for their particular thing. It's very, very rare that we will pick up photography that is not done by a photographer who's kind of on a time shortlist. But I mean, I don't want to speak to their particular priorities, but I think for photo in particular. However, we're always willing to, like, often we will, if we are, if you're seeing something happen that you think lends itself to a visual story, to say like, we've been here are some images of something that we think like could illustrate a potential story. I'm happy for that. But commissioning a photo-led story, I always tell freelancers when they come to me and they say, hey, I'm a photographer who's reporting on this, we just almost never take journalists who've just taken some photos and use it to illustrate their stories. It just doesn't really happen with us. We usually take like a professional photographer and we'll pair them with a professional reporter and do them in those kinds of ways. That's not necessarily the same with video. I think our video team, the bar may be slightly lower, but we'll certainly, we have a post-production team. So it might be one of those things that if you have raw footage that our post-production team can work with, but sort of on a case-by-case basis. We do some work with the Fuller Project. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that, but they're a sort of reporting NGO, and they specialize in stories that involve, that are of great concern to women. And they will actually bring in, they'll get journalists that we work with and we sort of partner with them they'll write stories and we will give a kind of platform for them. But we'll be involved from the commissioning point forward. It's just it's a sort of way of sharing resources, if you like. But we often use post-production, or we might finance photography for those kinds of stories.
So has your model of commissioning photography changed as a result of COVID, or as a result of the desire to commission more locally based photographers?
I mean, yeah, for an international desk, COVID has been a nightmare. I mean, the fact that we can't travel to show people the world, I'm sure I've in common with many of the people on this call, having to try and get people interested in things going around the world without being able to go there and show them it has been a real challenge. We've definitely tried to innovate as best as we can. We did when the anniversary of the Arab Spring happened in January, we had a Magnum photographer took photos through a laptop of portrait photography of people across the Arab world, which I was completely gobsmacked that we managed to do it. And we have managed to do workarounds, but there is just nothing that compares to actually being there and seeing things and getting active photography and video work. And so, yeah, it's been a challenge, and I'm very hopeful, and my correspondents are too, that we'll be able to repair that and get back on the road soon.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned that Anna had a similar question. Let's just give Anna the chance to come in and say hello. Anna? Are you still around, Anna? Okay.
Thanks, Mark. Sorry, I think my...
Hi, I just thought you may have a follow-up. Tell us where you're from.
Yes, so I'm Anna. I work for Plan International. Sorry, my computer took a little minute to get itself together there. But no, that answered my question. Dan, so thank you for that. I guess, so if I may, just a slightly different question from me would be, what is your lead time generally with stories? So I'm thinking things like, if we've got report launches, how is there value in coming to you a few weeks in advance of a launch, sort of saying, look, we've got this coming out, or actually do you prefer to make a call closer to the time of publication?
More time is better, I would say. That would allow us to give reporting that would complement it, or, you know, we never want to just do a kind of brief write-up that doesn't really add much to the conversation. I think when there is a study that speaks to one of the issues that we want to cover, that we, and, you know, with the permission as well. I mean, I know often when there's an embargoed study, you know, you do want to be quite cautious about how widely that information is being shared. And so we would always work hand in hand with people on that. But I think that would be far likelier to get coverage for us if we're able to report it out a little bit, to talk about the issues. Aaron Baker, who, as I said, is one of our climate change, she's sort of a master at that, really. She'll get a study and then really dig into it deeply and speak to people on every side of it, and add something to it that, yeah, that often, you know, will really engage with our readership. And yeah, I would love to have more pictures like that.
Do you have anything coming up, Anna? Any research or reports you want to mention?
A couple, yeah.
So you're the international arm rather than the UK arm of Plan.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I work at the global headquarters, so we do a lot of content gathering, which is why I asked the question about sort of pictures and video, because that's what our team spends a lot of time doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a report coming out about Venezuela, and sort of the situation of refugee girls, which potentially I thought might be sort of interest. So I can send you some more details about that if that would be helpful.
Yeah, happy to see it. We just did quite a big story on refugees in Venezuela. Actually, I beg your pardon. Well, it was Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. So related, but this is Venezuelan refugees presumably elsewhere in Central America. I
think it's Colombia, Peru and Ecuador.
Oh, okay.
So it's a kind of regional view, specifically on girls and young women, because we're a girls' rights organisation.
Huh.
Are you familiar with Plan International, Dan?
I'm sorry, Mum?
Are you familiar with Plan International? Have you come across them before?
I don't think I have, no. Okay.
Yeah, as Anna said, their main focus is girls and women, and they've done a lot of very good research over the years on the impact on girls' lives in particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, Anna, that would be very useful. We have Kira, who I mentioned before, who's one of our climate change correspondents, also covers Latin America for us, and has done actually a fair bit of coverage in that vein. And so, yeah, I think it would be very useful to
Okay, thanks, Anna. So Amarinda from Mercy Corps. Hi, Amarinda.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Dan. So I'm Amarinda from Mercy Corps. We're typically focused a lot on...
Are you familiar with Mercy Corps, Dan?
No.
All right, well, just tell us a bit about Mercy Corps.
Yeah, we typically focus a lot on sort of building longer term solutions, particularly around climate change and other stuff. So more locally led solutions for people being affected by climate, by conflict, by food shortages. So my question was sort of in terms of climate stories, particularly looking to COP26, which stories really resonate with your audience the most? Is it sort of the higher level policy stories, sort of looking at 1.5 Paris Agreement, or is it sort of human-led stories of people who are being affected in Uganda, in Indonesia by flooding, by food shortages, that sort of stuff? Or is it a fusion of the both?
I think it's a fusion of the both, yeah. I mean, I think policy stories are famously hard to make come alive unless you are able to, you know, it takes a very exceptional journalist, I think, who's able to take people to be a fly on the wall. I think actually you're more likely to engage people by showing them the ways in which these decisions are made at a high level and then the ways in which they're playing out. You know, part of what Time does is access journalism. To be frank, to get high up people to talk to us is something that we've proven quite good at, and I think probably at a policy level, and it may be, Justin, who's the correspondent I mentioned before, will probably have something, with some high level people, and figuring out what high level people are saying, I think is always interesting. But I think, the way to get a kind of broader, readership is to have the high and low. It's to start with the place where it's being felt on the ground, to sort of get into the decisions that are being made at a very high level, and then to show the outcomes. So I think, a little bit of a combo of the two.
Okay, Amarinder?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Okay, so we're just going to wrap up in a moment, unless anyone has a question. I guess my final question to you was, you said you received hundreds of pitches. So I think we'll try and be a bit more selective. What do you like in a pitch and what do you dislike? I mean, I guess first of all, it should be short.
Yeah, I mean, there's the basics, right? It's like, get my name right. But no, it's a hard thing. I will say, 70-80% of those are from freelance journalists, and I will take maybe 1 in 10 of those forward, if that. I think I would love, when we've worked with these sorts of pitches successfully in the past, it's when we've had some level of exclusivity about them. So it's either we have a heads up on a report before it comes, or there is a sort of, we can make available this person. I think a lot of it is the strength of the idea. It's what it's revealing. And I think especially on the 2030 project that we're doing, I think we're probably more likely to do kind of studies or reports that are trying to shed light about something that is solutions oriented, which I guess is what a lot of people are working on this call. But I think having that lead time a little bit to think of ways in which we can report it out is usually the best way to grab attention. But beyond that, I mean, in terms of style, a short pitch that lays out why Time in particular would be interested in this. When people who are familiar enough with the things that we do to say, like, we thought this might be good for 2030, or this might be of interest to mention in the Climate is Everything newsletter. I'm always impressed when people, and this mostly goes for freelance journalists, but always impressed when people have made an effort to kind of understand what our platforms are.
So they're personalizing, they're not just sending the same pitch to everyone on their mailing list. Right.
And I think also often what I get is a kind of like, I want to write my masterpiece for Time. We see this as a 5,000 word story. That's almost guaranteed to get, and that may be less relevant to here, but like to sort of to keep the ambition scaled to what is likely to happen, I think is also useful, because we're open to ambitious plays, of course, but it means that the bar is that much higher.
Okay, well, Dan, thanks very much for a great session. I mean, it's lovely that you are so engaged and receptive, and it's very impressive the way Time is reinventing itself. And very best luck with that. If we can just have a follow-up afterwards and you can send me a few email addresses, then I'll distribute them to the group. And thanks everyone for your questions. It's much more fun when everyone has questions rather than me asking all the questions. Thanks everyone.
And if you do pitch me, please don't be offended if I don't reply. It's inbox management is always a challenge. And,
definitely. Thanks, Dan.